I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered and operating on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Comox First Nation, where we live, learn, and collaborate together. With me today is my good friend Danita. I'm beyond pleased to have you here today, Danita, but more importantly, I wanted you here because in what we're talking about today and in what we're doing in the totality of it, it's important that I have someone that comes from a lived experience position. And you're a true catalyst for change, Danita, in that what you've done of late is groundbreaking. Can you please explain what that's all about?
For sure. Thothinegan Hushe, Kluchok Tui Husi. My name is Danita Bilozaze, and I am from Cold Lake First Nations. I work in School District 72. I am a national award-winning educator. But as of late, like Kevin had mentioned, I am the first person in all of Canada to reclaim my Indigenous name under the Calls to Action number 17 through Truth and Reconciliation. I'm pretty excited to ask you a few questions, so let's get started. Kevin, why is it that many First Nation communities do not have clean drinking water?
That's a great question, and probably the most important question. To understand that, in my opinion, we have to look at the broader picture, not just an isolated instance. We have to look at the historical and current context, if you will. So what I mean by that is we have to look at what systemic issues have been driving the lack of any infrastructure in First Nation communities. And we're not just talking, water is one component of a larger picture. Sanitation, education, healthcare, any infrastructure. And what we're talking about is basically a inequality, a distinct inequality of those fundamentals in First Nation communities when compared to non-Indigenous communities. So what I mean by that is, if you look at, and this is a very sensitive subject, and I have to be careful not to trigger in saying this, I want to say that as individuals were moved out into reserves, those reserves were undoubtedly remote, almost inaccessible. Some my only aircraft, ice roads, etc. And it's remained to be the same to this day. Out of sight, out of mind. So where we have that issue, it's then compounded with a model in placing infrastructure that's just, there's no other way of saying it, but it's just a broken model. It's terribly flawed. And it's not for lack of the government not funding. The government's funding dollars and cents. It's the model doesn't allow for that money to be spent accurately. What I mean by that is, for example, the government will provide up to 80% of a water system on a First Nation community. The First Nation must come up with 20% of that. So the problem, that sounds great, but here's the rub. In that, the typical design is a multi-million-dollar plant. So an $11 million plant. Let's just take Neskantaga as an example in Ontario. $16.6 million spent to date. 25 years boil water advisory. That community has not had water for 25 years. Even if they're able to produce and come up with 20% of 11, 16, $20 million water plants, then comes the maintenance and operations of that system, because that system, when it's on position on the First Nations community, it's then up to the First Nation to pay for the operations, which is municipal level cost and operating costs. The model cannot work, and it's designed to fail if you provide a community with an overbuilt, over-complex water system for just 250 people, for instance, and using Neskantaga as an example. So the typical process is a request for proposals. The government will say, we want to put a water system in. Years and years and years and years of development, engineering, et cetera, and studies are done. The contractor in this case came in and after 2 years was unable to complete the beginning of the project. So that First Nation said, we've had enough. The contract's torn up. We're not getting any further ahead. So that stalled the project out. That happens time and time again. In that specific case, the money was spent, but they're unable to proceed with the contract. That contractor actually sued the federal government and received $1.9, I think it is, million. He was rewarded for not completing the contract, which sounds crazy, but that's just typical. Now it's cost $1 million to fly water in to Niskandiga. Add to that the $1.9 million. Probably will look like about $27 million to build a water plant to supply 250 persons in the First Nation community. That's just that system built. With that same $27 million, we could place 12 of these systems in 12 First Nations to supply enough water for 2,200 people, and that $27 million would provide the costs and operations of those systems for 25 years. That's the problem. We have to look at it in a holistic approach as to why this, and many will call it a crisis, but let's just be honest, it's an emergency. If you're in a boil water advisory for 25 years, it's sort of superseded the level of crisis. And again, for instance, here in our community and municipality, if we have a boil water advisory, you can be sure within 24 hours they're looking at it and it's over in a few days. 25 years is inexcusable, right? And to take that a step further, to put water in a First Nations community is actually a lot easier fundamentally than it is to put a water system in a municipality with all the legalities and, in layman's terms, bureaucracy and red tape. It's a matter of forming a partnership with the First Nations chief, band and council and saying, here's what we're going to do. And those partners come together and you just put a system on. No one has to approve it because there is no regulatory oversight from the federal government and First Nation communities for drinking water. That's a lot of the problem too. So it's really, really complex, and the model's broken.
So how is your approach different from the previous approaches that have been taken?
It's important that we look at each of these deficiencies and lacks of access to safe, clean water as non-isolated. It's a broader picture. But in that, we can place a system, instead of just selling a solution for millions of dollars, we're not just here to sell a solution. We're here to be part of that solution and stay with that solution to effectively effect change. What that means is we have to address all of these key points. Those key points being a lack of acknowledgement of sovereignty, identity, First Nation governance, and their own ability to manage one's self and well-being on your own. Have a say in that. So we play a role in that. We assist in amplifying that necessity. We place a system and we provide the oversight. We don't just provide a set of keys and say, there you go, and you're off. Good luck, because that's the problem. We're going to remain to provide the proper amount of training, to provide the operators to feel confident in operating a system that's really not complex. Not an $11 million system. This is a very simple system. It's remotely monitored. It's touchscreen intuitive, just like a cell phone. It has a troubleshooting guide. We can talk to you on the video camera and talk right to the person in real time and help them along. We bridged a gap in pay equality as well. So that individual that's operating the First Nations water system right now is getting paid nothing in compared to their equivalent at a municipal system. We bridge that gap, equal pay. Second to that, we provide recurrent and consistent training. We do the risk assessments. We ensure that that community is part of that risk assessment, and that community's knowledge is increased every step of the way. We maintain and operate the system in a predictive and preventative maintenance aspect. So what you end up with is a predictable, sustainable water treatment system. And it's really that simple.
So with your solutions that you've mentioned, this is the contribution to the change that's needed, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah. This is the contribution. It's important that we understand why we're doing this. It's important to understand those individuals that we're contributing to. That's you and I could talk about that for 42 days and not get through it all, Danita, I don't think. Yeah, you're right, it's important.
Can you tell me a little more about the technology?
We like to call this a community clean drinking water system, or a sustainable clean drinking water system. One of the most innovative aspects of what we've done here is we are harnessing as much renewable energy as we can in order to produce clean drinking water, safe access to clean drinking water. So we use solar, wind energy, water energy as much as possible. So for instance, surface water flowing in a creek, we can take that and use a small turbine to generate power. If there's enough wind, we can use that energy, and solar, of course, as well. So we're doing everything we can to harness renewable energy and reduce those emissions, greenhouse gases. If there's not enough solar energy, obviously in the dark of winter or the snow trespass, etc., then we'll use as much wind and or water, but we can always fall back onto grid power if need be. We try not to do that, of course. The system is accessible remotely, which means we can dial in through cellular, Wi-Fi, satellite communications, and 24 hours a day we can manage and monitor the system. We can pretty well operate 85 to 90% of its abilities from remotely, so from your phone or a tablet. That means that we're monitoring that system continuously. Any alarms, we get a notification. So does the operator. So we're actively participating in what's going on with the trend. We stay away from membrane, reverse osmosis, and other technology like that. We use filter media, multimedia layered in a system that can really rough out super turbid water, the very dark brown muddish water, into Canadian drinking water guidelines, crystal clear. Automated backwash is programmed into the system. And in addition to that, it's a touch screen, which is managed it's essentially designed around a cell phone, which unfortunately, everybody now knows how to use, more so than a notepad and a book. So definitely suited for each case and designed around each contaminated body of water. There's a lot of engineering that goes into that, but rapid deployment. It's on site. It can be pulled through the back of a truck and a trailer, pulled by a helicopter, transported to the back of an aircraft. It can land right at the airstrip in Neskantaga and be operating within 3 days after we unfold it and set it back up.
That sounds very impressive. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Danita. Thank you for taking your time. I'm grateful to have you ask me these important questions. Thanks.